Today we're going to talk about food policy and rural life. So, when we think about food policy and we think about, you know, just the basic things that we need in terms of being able to survive, we need to have adequate shelter, we need to have adequate food, access to health care, um, access to finance. And so when we look at in 2020, there were 38.3 million people who lived in food insecure households. 9.4 million adults live with very low food security. 6.1 million children lived in food insecure households, um, and all along with children, and that were all insecure. So you can look here and take a look at this map that's attached, and you can see the darker regions have, this above average food insecurity. And so some of the states, some of the ones that are on here are surprising. So, my home state of Mississippi doesn't come as a surprise as it's the 50th out of 50 per capita. So they're a poor state anyway. Surprised by Texas, as well as New Mexico, in terms of just the amount of food insecurity there. We see that it's across our nation, but it's less severe in places like Minnesota where we actually live. But it's problematic. It's a part of food policy. So we've got this whole notion of, the USDA actually does these measures that really look at this. So when we talk about food insecurities and we break them into categories, here's what we mean. We've got high food security, where people don't have any issues as it relates to accessing food. Marginal, where people have occasional issues. Low food security, where there's a reduced quality and variety of diets, but eating patterns aren't substantially altered. And then you have very low food security that exhibits disrupted eating, reduced eating patterns by one or more members of the family because of lack of money. So, the USDA, the government, is aware that there are these issues that are there, and there are a number of different programs that we'll talk about that are designed to try to address them, but it still becomes an issue of policy. There's some other issues that kind of come up. There's a documentary film that it's not accessible for you guys right now, but I still wanted to share some of the findings of that particular film. And it talks about obesity being a rate. If we go in the projected term by 2030, we'll be at 42%. Diabetes, 1 in 3 people will contract the early onset of diabetes. Among minorities, the statistic is still 1 in 2, so really 50%. We got food deserts. We got fast food places that are centered in lower income communities, and no supermarkets that are closed. So what are people going to actually eat as we think about those things? So all again a part of food policy. So there are some governmental food programs like SNAP, which formerly is food stamps, which is some supplemental, can't read today, nutrition assistance program that really is means tested and base the amount of aid on family size and income. And then there's WIC, which is a special nutritional program for women, infants, and children, for folks who are pregnant, breastfeeding, for women and infants and children. So again, really looking at, because we know the right amount of nutrition has implications early on for children if they don't receive all of the things that they need in terms of their ability to develop and to grow at a normal rate. These are some other food policies that are a little less known but have been active and a part of our communities for a while. The National School Lunch Program, which provides free and reduced lunch. School breakfast programs that provide breakfast for school. Milk programs. Summer food programs. So when people are out of school, that there are some school functions that still provide that meal for kids during the summer when they are out of school, where they would normally get that. Emergency food assistance programs, and then the child and adult food care programs are some other programs that also help address some of this issue around hunger. So switching gears, we're going to move on to rural family, rural life and farming. And so when our food is hard to separate the two, foods are primarily grown on farms, right? And so the family farm, which we all have these romantic visions of being hardworking, strong, independent folks, close-knit communities, and just the rural family farming is just kind of a way of life to this very day. So it still does present itself that way. So there have been, as you can imagine, some legislation and social policy around Farm Security and Rural Investment Act. So looking at taking care of helping farmers when there's disasters with their livestock, increasing SNAP eligibility so that, farmers can get those products to markets, and people who are on, don't have a lot of money to buy, have access to SNAP, and they can buy those things that are nutritious for their family. Rural development, bio-based fuels, disease management, and funding for beginning farmers are some of the things that this particular act actually kind of moved forward. So there are some new issues that are coming up as it relates to farming and rural life. So we have seen in recent years the increase of the need for fuel. And so biofuels, so ethanol in particular, and then biodiesel are different products that farmers are now producing. So there are fields of corn, and ethanol is pretty much a corn-based subject. So where we were growing food to feed people, now we're actually growing food to feed automobiles in terms of being able to provide alternative fuel sources. And then also fracking. And so we've noticed that there has been well, in the recent past, a reduction in the amount of fuel costs because we're less dependent on foreign oil. But that's done largely because we are actually able to do fracking. So this is a process that there's a drilling using water, chemicals, and sand injections to release the natural gas from shale rocks. So we can utilize that to heat our homes in the winter, to power cars, to do any number of different things. However, you know, most of the fracking that happens in fairly close proximity, if not on farmlands. And so when you have all of this waste material that is left over as a result of getting the gas and products out of the ground, then we contaminate field water, we contaminate growing uh, land, we damage soil, we do things of that particular nature, as well as biofuels and ethanol have a higher concentration of nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas that's comparable to CO2. And so the more we eventually burn this ethanol, which is a cheaper form of film, we're kind of exacerbating the problem at the other end by creating greenhouse effects, which continue to have impacts for climate change. So again, newer issues that are problematic. Also, the face of U.S. farming is changing. Back in 1960, there were like 4 million farmers or farms. Now there's like 2.2 million, so almost cut in half. Um, Family average incomes are fairly low. 13% of people who have farms, their income actually comes from the farm, and 73% of their income comes from off-farm activities, so jobs in other places. We also see that the average age of farmers is like 58, and there are only 5% that are under 35. So we're, people getting out of the business, aging out of the business. We have this whole consolidation issue around the billions of acres of farmland, and 4%, only 4% of that land is owned, and 47% of that particular, those billions of acres is actually owned by 4% of the farmers. Women are not represented well in farming. They only make up 14%, and they don't make a lot of money when they are farming. And then rural health and food quality are issues because of the continuous exposure to chemicals and various odors and factory farms. Our miscarriages, neurological diseases, bacteria contamination, and animal biotics are also issues that are facing as we need to feed more and more people. Science is coming up with ways to produce grain and animals using antibiotics and other things to increase the growth rate, making them larger, but also making them unhealthier for us to actually consume. There are about 800,000 to a million farm workers who leave following the crop every year, many of them coming from Mexico. The demographics are here in terms of what the makeup is. Um, only a quarter of those folks coming from Mexico speak English. So it puts them in a compromising position in that not always understanding, and could set them up to be exploited in terms of some of the labor conditions as well. Health insurance is rare if existent at all. And then we're being paid poverty level wages for a family. 30% of their 30% of these families are actually living below the poverty line. So these are just kind of a snapshot of what's happening. The other issues as it relates to farming is that it's becoming corporatized. And so the smaller family farms are going away because they are losing the ability to compete with some of the larger agricultural giants. In some research here, I learned that ConAgra is one of the largest distributor of agricultural chemicals. And get this, it owns all of these different corporations that are here. So the products, many of them I like and love, are actually owned by this large conglomerate. And then we have the notion also when you've got entities that are let large and they command that much power in the food market, then they negotiate with farmers or they actually manage the farms in different ways. So the people who own the farms aren't necessarily the people who manage the farms. We also have this proliferation of genetic engineering in terms of making seeds, um, but these seeds are actually making crops more vulnerable to disease and pest infestation, as well as the antibiotics that we're seeing showing up in poultry and livestock that are coming to our shelves. The ability to trade globally has been compromised somewhat with price controls in terms of what farmers are able to ask for as they're selling to other countries. Food safety is an issue. Selling locally, organic farming, and sustainable development are all issues that farmers are having to address. And there are other problems as it relates to consumer safety. And so you can see here there was this particular law that was passed back in 2011 because we had a kid who died after an E. coli infection. And so again, it's problems in our food chain, making sure that our food is safe and edible for us, and that we need to be mindful of those particular things as well too. And then also government, has this inability to actually, hold companies responsible who don't respond to recalls. So I read also in some research that it's actually cheaper for a company to pay a lawsuit than stop a production line. If I've got hundreds of thousands of pounds of beef being processed by a plant and there is an outbreak of E. coli and we trace it back to this camp, then all while the tracing process is actually happening, meat is still being packaged and sent out that's potentially contaminated. And rather than stop the line because it would result in a huge loss of profit for the agency, they just have a slush fund to pay out lawsuits while they try to correct the problem but continue to move the lines forward in many cases. So it's just kind of a sad state of affairs in that the need to continue to acquire wealth when it's harmful to other people can be problematic. So a snapshot of what's happening with food policy in our farm, you see that there are governmental interests in terms of agencies that are prepared or are charged with actually bird dogging and making sure the system is legitimate and fair, making sure that some of the poor folks in our communities have access to nutritious and healthy food, but also recognizing the issues as it relates to the health problems that people are having as a result of the food and the quality of the food or access to the food at the same time. So hopefully this will help you have a little bit better understanding as you kind of sit down for your next meal to think about where did this food come from and what did it really cost from a social capital standpoint. Thank you.